Hello again. So it's nice to be here, and today we're going to cover the second chapter of the precepts of the Bodhisattva vow. This is the aspiring Bodhisattva vow, which I'll explain a bit. But first, let's try to set our motivation. So, following from all our previous sessions, trying to find a position within ourselves where we can use the opportunity of listening or of talking or thinking just this time to set our minds to and our commitment to consider everybody, all beings, all sentient beings, and do our best to work for them. And if we recognize the availability of Buddhahood for us as the best option, the best ability to help all beings, then to set our minds on becoming a Buddha in order to benefit all beings. But in the end, the important thing is to consider the needs of everybody rather than just those who we are close to. Okay, so this week is sort of the second part of the chapter on maintaining the bodhicitta. So bodhicitta, if you remember, is the mind set on enlightenment, and certainly within a Buddhist context, this is considered to be enlightenment is considered to be the most efficacious means by which we can benefit other beings. So the two aspects of this, which we'll be going through again, are to sustain a conviction that we ourselves are able to become Buddhas, and we are able to walk that path of becoming. If you're unfamiliar with what a Buddha is in this context, what a Buddha is somebody who's spontaneously and effortlessly able to benefit everybody that they meet. So this is another way of looking at what a Buddha is. And so we take on the idea that we can work towards this goal, and secondly, that we are doing this out of a sense of responsibility and compassion for all beings without exception. So these two things, this loving kindness and compassion, and this conviction that we ourselves are able to become Buddhas, and then the additional mind that I am going to do this, that this is something I will do. This responsibility is a bodhicitta. It means body means enlightenment, citta means mind, so the mind of enlightenment. And when we have this mind of enlightenment, on those moments where the mind of enlightenment is ripe in us or appears in our mind, then we are, in a sense, bodhisattvas. So they're beings who are walking towards or sincere in their aspiration to become Buddhas. So a bodhisattva is somebody who has bodhicitta. This is a very simple way of looking at it. I mean, very easy to understand. But sometimes bodhisattva means a little bit more. It depends upon what particular level of the path we're examining in that particular case. But in general, we can argue the case that if we have managed to generate bodhicitta within our minds, then we are bodhisattvas. And once we have bodhicitta in our mind, then we have also entered into the Mahayana, the great vehicle. So within that particular case, what we've been doing so far is talking about the aspirational aspect of bodhicitta. This is the aspiration to become a Buddha, not necessarily the engaged, which is where we actually take on the vast number of vows and start training it in the six perfections themselves. So at the moment, it's like we are developing the wish to become a Buddha, more than just a wish, but a conviction, a decision that we're going to do this, and then when we engage in that, that's like actually doing the journey itself. However, and what's so important about this is that the engaged aspect of bodhicitta depends completely on our aspiration. So although it might feel that sometimes, deciding that I want to go to Paris, for instance, might not feel that I'm actually getting to Paris, but the buying of the tickets and making the time and preparing to go and so on to get to Paris depends upon me still having that aspiration to go to Paris. So if I mess up with the ticket, and so some of my plans go awry, it's my aspiration, it's my intention to go to Paris, which keeps me carrying on. Whereas if, for instance, I have a ticket and then I have no particular interest in going to Paris anymore, the fact that I have laid out all of these things does not mean that I'll get to Paris, because I've given up on the interest in going to Paris at all. So therefore we can see that essentially the aspirational aspect of bodhicitta is not to be diminished. It's absolutely foundational to the Mahayana path. And so up until this point, we've been talking primarily, and we will continue to the end of this chapter, talking about the aspirational aspect of bodhicitta. And the vow that we were talking about earlier on is the aspirational vow, not the engaged vow, which comes later on too. So what we're talking about are the precepts of the aspirational vows of bodhicitta, or the bodhisattva vow. So the first, or the entry-level bodhisattva vow. And so far in the first half of the chapter, what we discussed were the four precepts that were based upon preventing us from losing strength in our conviction, in our decision. In this life, they're sort of done in this life and future life. And the four ones we did for that was to remember to recall the benefits of enlightenment and the benefits of the spirit of enlightenment, so to increase our enthusiasm for it. And also then was also the precept of recollecting at least 6 times a day that mind, so to maintain in our mind stream, to actually keep on thinking it repeatedly, to generate it at least 6 times a day. And again, then also not to abandon beings for whom we are developing this. And we will see again and again, Je Rinpoche will say again and again, this is even one person is abandoning. So we have to be careful not to abandon in general, or also specifically. And lastly, to carry on accumulating the merit and wisdom, the two great collections, which are called the Great Collections. So one of the things that one finds in terms of various different Buddhist traditions is what you need to do in order to become a Buddha. And in this particular tradition, and in many other traditions too, this is divided into two great collections: what's known as the merit, the doing good things, be it not just physical but mentally and also in the speech, and likewise developing insight. So these two together work. And sometimes, in some cases, the merit, the collection of merit, is talked about in terms of compassion, because essentially the basis of merit is loving kindness and compassion. So sometimes we have this as saying these are the two great wings: the altruistic thought and the insight that we need to balance in terms of our flight to enlightenment. And then again, another way is to look at is to talk about bliss. So bliss is the fruit of merit, and it is often sometimes said, the great collections are mentioned in terms of bliss because of the huge amounts of benefit arising from beneficial actions. So these are generally the ways in which these two are divided. But the two great collections are found right across the Tibetan Himalayan traditions, and as well as many other former and later Mahayana traditions. So that's the sort of what we covered last week, really. And then this week, what we're really talking about is the training in the precepts that prevent us from separating from spirit of enlightenment in the future lives. So this is generally divided into four, and four that we should do, four sort of mistaken actions, and four correct actions, four things that we should do. And a lot of this is going to be about speech. And we talked in first semester about the body, speech, and mind, and in terms of the way in which we look at actions and consequences. Often the division is made in terms of the body, the speech, and the mind. So what does speech mean? And there's sometimes we imagine that it has to be something we say, but it's not really the case. I think one needs to remember that it's really primarily about communication rather than about speech. So if we're communicating, this is considered to be a speech action. Obviously, if we're writing, then there's some sort of physical activity, but it's the communication component of that which is impactful, or most impactful, I guess. If you're making ink out of blood, the blood of slain animals or whatever, then you could say, well, that's not particularly good. But in the end, it's actually the words that we say that convey the meaning, in terms of what we're writing. So likewise, speech action is not just to be considered to be what we say. Otherwise I could lie without saying anything. What I'm saying is we can lie without saying anything. We could just go, thumbs up or thumbs down, or sigh or show a glance in a particular way. And this is we are totally able to deceive or to criticize or to make judgment in a way which is condemning others through these actions. So of the first four that are talked about, the mistaken actions that we need to avoid because they weaken the spirit of enlightenment, they weaken the bodhicitta. And Je Rinpoche in this particular case is depending upon the Kasyapa chapter, which is one of the collections of sutras in the Ratnakuta collections, a very, very early, maybe 2nd century Mahayana collection of sutras. I think about 40 of them. So he says this is taken primarily from these very early Mahayana sutras. So he says that one of the ways in which we want to look at these is in terms of all of these is in terms of the object, who it is that we are doing this, engaging in, and then also what it is that we're doing. And so these particular two things are the way in which we can actually look at that. And he says the first of the mistaken practices is to deceive our preceptors, our abbots, our teachers, and those worthy of offering. In this particular case, this means those who are sincere in their path, in the practice of their path, and also those people who may not be practitioners, but they support practice. So they're helping or assisting us in the development of our path. So it's quite a large number of people. And then Je Rinpoche says, well, it should be quite clear about what the object of these objects are. I mean, we know what an abbots and teachers and preceptors are, so it's not too unclear about this. And he said, and those worthy of offerings is as I described it. So we don't need to, we know what that is. And he says, well, what is it that we might be doing here in this case? And he says it's when we consciously or deliberately, if we prefer, deceive them. So it's at this particular point, the commentary also says that if they explain a transgression, they sort of say, it's really not good to bear anger, for instance, an example, or to bear a grudge, and then you sort of say, I never bear a grudge, even though you're telling your friends about all the grudges that you have, and this then is considered to be an intention to deceive. So he says, in this particular case, it's where we actually we tell a lie. We're not just sort of stringing somebody along. We're actually telling a lie. And as I say here, he says one of the things in the compendium of trainings is that there's one of the ways in which we can test this is if we were to say such a thing one of our fellow practitioners, and and something else to the teacher, and our fellow practitioner says, be careful because that will come to your teacher's ears, right? Then in that sense, it's like thinking, okay, if I'm the fact that I'm telling different stories, or I'm not being honest about this, then this is definitely a sign that what I'm doing is one of these mistaken practices. So the second of the four mistaken practices is to generate regret about something that should not be regretted. So one of the four remedies of bad action, if we make a mistake, we transgress our vows or precepts, is regret and remorse. So a sense of of embarrassment or ashamedness, or also a sense of this is not what I want to be, not what I want to be remembered for. I don't want to remember myself in this way. So this sense of conviction that what I've done is remorseful is very powerful when we're using it against bad mistaken action, right? But here it's like saying when it's not mistaken, for us to try to engender this remorse for something that's actually very good is a mistaken action itself. So in this particular case also, this is like where somebody is doing something which is correct, they're practicing sincerely, their practice and their sincere practice might be very, very, very different from our own, because they're following the path that they're following. But if we make them regret what they're doing in terms of their sincerity of their path, then this becomes a mistake. So it seems like, well, why would you ever do that? Well, sometimes, for instance, let's say one is jealous of a fellow student in terms of their progress, and one wants to cloud their progress and make it hard for them to see whether or not they're doing. Then we might say something which would cause them to be concerned about what they're doing, and maybe possibly even regret what they're doing. And in this particular case, is considered to be a very dark, a very mistaken approach to our practice, and quite clearly weakens our own sincerity. So the third one is to speak disparagingly to those who have correctly entered the Mahayana. So there's a bit of a discussion about what entered the Mahayana means, and some say it means whether or not you have at any point achieved or managed to enter the Mahayana, or whether or not you've currently have the mind, the spirit of enlightenment available to you, and whether or not you're holding vows. Some say you need to have actually the engaged vows. Others say you just need the aspirational vows, um, and um, and Je Rinpoche says, look, it doesn't specify. It says, if you're correctly entered the Mahayana, we know that having correctly entered the Mahayana means that you've generated the aspirational spirit. You've made the decision that this is what you're going to do. And at that point, then you are definitely an object in this particular case. So what's being done is to speak disparagingly, is to blame or to be libelous and so on. So libelous here is not necessarily the same meaning we would normally apply to it, and the translators or the commentary reflects that. So so Jeremy Piché says, it's like specifically if it's to in its worst case is when it's um, when it's deliberately with a malign interest, and also with in other words, one wants to damage their practice, and also to for them to lose their belief or to stop practicing the Mahayana. But he says, he says that even just understanding that, you know, this sort of level of blame is not good. He says, for instance, that it's made clear that disparaging is saying somebody has poor character, um, which is where, you know, so this is what is meant by this, and he says, and this is included. So if you say, oh, they have got poor character, but you don't qualify a particular fault, then this is being disparaging, and this is not good. Again, blame is saying, you know, oh, such and such a monk, you know, he calls himself a monk, but is not celibate. This is where we are specific and reliable in this particular case. And I said this is a reading of using the word libel to describe these different technical things is where we say not only is he not celibate, but this is who he had sex with, and they did it last Tuesday, and so on and so on, right? So even more specific. So then Je Rinpoche says that it doesn't really, this sort of mind of disparaging or putting down um, is really probably a terrible problem. And in fact, when previously in earlier chapters, we've talked already about the dangers of criticism and how powerful they are. So there's other things that supposedly is that if we are furious and we make these criticisms against a bodhisattva, um, then we ourselves can lose our Mahayana. And it's not only that, it's one of the only ways that once we've entered into the Mahayana path, that we can end up being born in the lower realms. So it's considered to be one of the great, you know, the great obstacles in terms of the Mahayana practice. So I think I'm not sure it's here, but he um, no, that comes next. So we'll do that in a sense. So a part of this will also be looking at saying, well, how do we know who's a bodhisattva? So this essentially provides us with a great risk, because we don't have to know that they're a bodhisattva for this to become a problem for us. We just have them, if they lose their practice, or they lose their, um, uh, but it shakes their mind, or they even just hear what we're saying, and they're bodhisattvas, then the damage is done for on our side. So because we're modeling an incredibly destructive behavior, right? So this is out there now, it's in the world, and therefore there's very little that can be done about it. And Jeremy says, you know, this thing also is, before we go into the fourth of the mistaken practices, he says, if we allow our hatred a chance, then all the love and compassion that we've developed is weakened, and not only weakened, but it begins to dissipate, because hatred is based on the idea, in this case, of wanting to punish, or feeling that somebody should be punished, or wanting to harm, or feeling that somebody should be harmed. And this mind of saying, you know, I want to diminish you, disempower you in any sense, a disempowerment in terms of saying you lose some form of autonomy or lose some sort of freedom, and this is what I intend for you, is exactly the opposite of how you should be feeling as a bodhisattva. So if we're working on the idea that all beings have a right to full empowerment, then why are we picking on somebody and saying, no, they need to be disempowered? Yeah. So especially when what they're doing, they're really sincerely working in as hard as they can on doing the right thing, then it's very, very dangerous and a mistake for us to neglect to consider what they're doing for some sort of arbitrary reason. And he says not only that, if we can free ourselves from hatred through mindfulness and vigilance, if we can make sure that we don't do this, then when we are free of this sort of sense of being harmed by what is incompatible with us. So there's often we feel that there's something incompatible between us, and that creates this harmfulness. If we can free ourselves from that mind, then love naturally arises. And this is quoting Dharmakirti. So he says that we really need to continue to work on and develop this kindness and this understanding, this empathy, um, and along with it, this compassion, which is to recognize how hard it is for us sometimes to accept a behavior, but also to recognize that behavior is not necessarily something that somebody has any control over on their side too. So being aware of the needs, their needs and our needs also, in order to relate to that, to be able to provide some sort of stability, some awareness of, or ability to act according to the situation. So it's not always just roll over and take the damage or whatever. One has to think carefully about what the right approach is. Just as if one is as we've said before, is a mother looking at her newborn. The newborn might do something that's wrong, but and to ignore it encourages the newborn to do it again. So we need to find exactly the right way to respond in order to benefit the newborn. So the fourth is using deceit and misrepresentation um, to get benefit of others from others. So this in this particular case is anyone other than ourselves. Not, it doesn't have to be a practitioner at all. And the point about this is, what are we doing is when we're using deceit or misrepresentation to get something out of it. So he says, in this particular case, what we're really looking at is especially cheating, or being misrepresentative and not being honest. For instance, possibly sort of persuading somebody to give you something which you know they undervalue, and therefore you can take advantage of the fact that they undervalue it when it actually has a very high value, would be an example. So you say, oh, that crown you have, it's just a theatrical crown. It looks like gold, but it's just brass. I'll buy it off you for £20, and then you sell it for £1 million, right? Then this would be deceit and misrepresentation. There's another story he says, for instance, it's like if you send somebody, somebody's going to, you say, oh, look, I know that we're going to France. It's only a little bit further for you um, to travel to Paris. Would you mind giving this letter to somebody in Paris, or a parcel to somebody in Paris? And that'd be very, very kind of you. And somebody says yes, okay. And then what you say is, actually, well, if you're in Paris, then you can take the train easily to Moscow. And in fact, I've got this parcel which needs to go to Moscow. And in this particular case, it's like saying, well, my plan all along was for you to go to Moscow, but I knew that if I said Paris, it would loosen you enough to go to Moscow. So in that sense, it's like being deceitful, asking somebody to do more, and to do a little bit, and then actually extending that with the original intention that they would probably say no to Moscow, but having warmed them up on the process, this would be deceitful. And he says Asanga makes this very clear in Asanga's compendium, the Abhidhamma Samachaya. He says primarily that these arise because of attachment to goods and services is in our mind, and therefore this is both rests on attachment in terms of grasping, but also in ignorance in terms of recognizing the lack of efficacy that these material objects or services actually have in terms of benefiting us. So there he says, if we also pretend to have a good quality that we don't have, and also to hide our faults and misrepresent ourselves, then this is something that we should be concerned about in terms of sustaining our bodhicitta. So he's saying, we need to be very sincere, honest people, and we need to be careful not to cheat. So these sort of qualities are very important for us in terms of sustaining our bodhicitta. So those are the four that we cover in terms of the dark practices, and then we have those which are, or the mistaken, and then we have those to adopt, which are the correct practices. And not only do they prevent us they sustain us in keeping our spirit of enlightenment from weakening, but they also act as um, um, opponents or forces against those mistaken practices in self. So the first of those is to consciously is to forsake, completely give up on, and work to give up on consciously lying to any being whatsoever, even in jest or even for the sake of our lives. So he says, again, this is deceit, and the point about if we are able to do this and not even lie, to remain sincere and not even lie at all out of a joke, then this is extremely powerful method of honesty. It's a very powerful way of remaining honest, and of course it helps us free us from the mistaken attitude of deceiving our abbots or teachers, because we're not going to deceive anybody. Now, there are some cases where, and it's established later on, there are some cases where lying is actually justified and necessary, and those cases are not being referred to here in this particular case. So the idea is to say, in general, we want to stop lying completely. And then the second of the four correct practices is to remain sincere and non-deceptive. So it's whatever we do, in terms of when I said them just now, there are occasions when we are lie, and those points are very much to do with when we're doing what is definitely the best for the object of our lie. So there are cases sometimes, normally lying is a disempowerment in sense of that if I tell a lie, I remove the opportunity for that person to respond to the truth, right? So I'm not even allowing for them to respond to that truth. And sometimes that's done because we are self-centered. We're doing it because we don't want to seem to be wicked or bad or whatever. Sometimes it's done because we have a sense of security or protection for the object of the object of our lie, and we don't want them to be harmed by a truth. But there are sometimes also when, in fact, the lie is a temporary one or it is a necessary one, because in the end it provides empowerment to that individual, which is very, very rare, but it can happen where, in fact, let's say for the time being, I've got to tell a lie because this person is upset about something else, and it will just create more trouble. And if they have too much on in their times, then maybe it's not so good for them. But we need to be very, very wary of this in terms of using it as a rationalization or an excuse. So we have to be far, far better, to be honest, when we can. Yeah, and accept and hope in general that people are able to accept the lie, accept the truth, rather than to provide them with an easy lie. And again, here he's saying, we need to be sincere, and regardless of this, we need to remain sincere. And that means, he says, is to be honest and to absolutely consider the needs of the individual. So sincerity in terms of our practice is in terms of our bodhicitta, is to remember and to recollect this sense of cherishing, compassion, and this wish to help that we've dedicated ourselves to. And remember, in the end, these beings, to whoever they are, we are dedicating our entire future to benefiting them, right? We're hoping maybe they benefit us, but also they're benefiting us through either becoming Buddhas, but also through being the objects of our compassion. So in that sense, it's very, very important for us to hold a degree of recognition of how important they are to us in terms of objects of our practice. Yeah. And that leads us on to the correct attitude, or the correct practice, or number 3 of the 4. And this one here is to develop the idea that all bodhisattvas are the teacher. So here he says this is all bodhisattvas and that they are similar to the teacher. Now that doesn't mean that we should accept everything that every bodhisattva tells us, right? Because we're all in different areas and we're all doing our different we're all at different levels, and we've all got our own issues. So but the point about it is to recognize that that sincerity and that decision to become a Buddha is equivalently providing us with an example and an instance of another being, another person who is working towards Buddhahood. Now, in our early, especially in our early practice, as with a very weak, unstable bodhicitta, then this is very, very, very important. But even later on, it's important because later on we'll have a respect towards those who are junior and unstable because they're having a go, because they're trying. Yeah, because everybody who's doing that having a go. It might differ from us, might differ, their methods might be different from us, their views might be different from us, their religion might be different from us, but it doesn't matter in terms of the ability and the dedication to that sort of goal, right? He says if we um, um, he says when we're practicing, especially, he says we often sometimes manage to develop a little bit of this sort of virtue. We become slightly better people through our practice, and our bodhicitta or our compassion and our loving kindness is just there and a bit wavery, maybe not very stable. But at the end of the day, it's there's something there, and he says it can sometimes feel that it's just very very slow progress. It doesn't seem to be stabilizing or increasing. Um, and sometimes it looks like it's all going to go away very easily. It's very wobbly, and he said this is primarily because of our fury or our discomfort with our fellow practitioners and our friends, and this means spiritual friends. So in this particular case, he's saying this is both past life and current life. If we have this attitude where we're sort of arguing with or unhappy with or even mentally arguing, not necessarily just actually arguing, then this weakens our practice. And he says there's another quality of that, which is that essentially if we're able to sustain these three that we've mentioned so far in terms of developing these three correct practices, then huge numbers of precepts found in all the sutras, and especially all the Mahayana sutras, just never arise. Right. So if we're looking for an easy win in terms of all the different many precepts there are, if we're able to sustain this sincere, honest, and um, a strong respect for practitioners as well, sincerity, honesty, and respect, um, then this really helps to eliminate causes of all sorts of problems for us in our practice. So again, he says, if we can actually do this in terms of all beings, he said, because there's a problem, one of the a challenge, which is we don't really know who is a bodhisattva. Yeah, until we're beyond a bodhisattva, which means we're a Buddha, we don't know whether or not somebody is on the path who's above us, more experienced than us. We might have a guess, but it's easy and often the case that somebody who's more experienced than us appears to us to be less experienced or not at all experienced to us. For people who are less experienced than us, it's easier for us to recognize how experienced they are, unless it happens to be somebody who's more experienced than us, right? So we don't really necessarily know. In terms of spiritual path, one has insight generally in terms of those people who are less, or those beings who are less able than ourselves. But there are times when those who are superior to us are able to manifest or appear to be less able than they really are. And they do this for all sorts of reasons, such as, for instance, to help us in our training and many other reasons. So it's not even unusual. It might feel like odd or sort of some sort of trick. It's not. It's just basically essentially the more able we are, the more different ways we are of being able to meet people's needs in terms of training. So this aspect here is that we'll have a pretty good idea about whose practice, but we don't really ever know. And therefore, his saying is that essentially um, it's a good idea for us to consider that all beings are the teacher. So, well, that would mean everybody, all beings, all sentient beings are the teacher. The teacher here means Buddha, okay, like Buddha. So how can we do that? And essentially one of the aspects of that, as I mentioned or alluded to earlier on, is to recognize that every single sentient being, regardless of whether enlightened or not enlightened, or suffering or not suffering, it is they are a part of and an integral part of our path. We depend upon their suffering in order to develop our compassion and our loving kindness. We depend upon their uh, we depend upon their wisdom, in terms of teachers, to help us understand and walk the path. So in this sense, one of the aspects, another way of looking at this is to say that if we recognize that actually the Dharma, the Buddha Dharma is truth, is the way in which things are, then all beings naturally demonstrate the truth. So if we see somebody having an argument and then we see how it punishes their mind, we're learning from that. We have the opportunity to learn how these actions and consequences take place. Now, it's going to be a cause of suffering for them, and therefore we need to be aware of the fact that this opportunity not only has taught us Dharma, but also has given us the object of of compassion, which is what we need in order to generate the motive to become Buddhas. So it's not as if we are saying, oh, well, they're Buddhas, so therefore I don't need to practice, right? What we're saying is it's an attitudinal approach, which is to say, I have to find a strong respect for um, uh, um, and and I feel a great deal of more love, kindness, and empathy for beings. And this way, then the mind of sort of saying, they're no good, they're rubbish, is diminished considerably. Yeah. So this way is very, very powerful, and it lends itself into um, some of the lightning techniques used in Tantra, which are not really mentioned in this particular text. So it's very, very strong in terms of its approach, and it's very powerful. But also, one has to be able to recognize that if I'm seeing all people as Buddhas, that doesn't mean I need to trust them as I would trust a Buddha, or to go around revering them as if they were Buddha, because it's just going to look like a fruitcake if we do that, right? So we have to be aware of our of our relationships in terms of what they're expecting, but also inside is this strong respect. So then the fourth of these correct practices is to help um, for those who we're working with. So not necessarily sort of those who see us as a teacher, but those who we're trying to encourage in our journey. So those are our friends who we are working with, who are sincere practitioners, or those who are young, who we are hoping to become better people, or even old, who are hoping to become better people. So all of these here is then to sort of say, primarily, it's a good idea for us to help them in their maturity and not and also to encourage them to consider the Mahayana view. So it's not always appropriate, and that's absolutely correct. And it's not, if somebody says, I can't do the Mahayana, and they're a student or they're in a practice, that's not a fault on our side. But to recognize the big picture, to think about all beings. This is very good if we can actually help to convey the big picture rather than just the smaller picture. So we're considering to say, well, look, think about the bigger team, think about the responsibility to all beings, not just ourselves, right? This helps a huge amount. And he says this also helps to eliminate the second of the bad practices, which is making other people feel regret. So so this is also very good. And I should have said that when we are able to think of all bodhisattvas as our teacher, this helps to remove the third of the mistaken attitudes, which is speaking disparagingly, right? So saying bad things about people or to them. And he says, how does it do that? But basically, very simply, it's because if from the um, if what we want from the depths of our heart is for others to work towards enlightenment, or to work towards the benefit of all beings, um, then we're not going to go around bringing unhappiness to such people, right? We're not going to go around trying to snipe them or to damage them or to damage their reputation. So we're going to um, um, you know, why on earth, if we want them to succeed, why on earth would we want for them to develop regret in that journey, right? It's sort of the mutually opposite. So he said this is the sort of thing, is like saying, for instance, in the sutra requested by a lion, it's Mahayana Sutra, he says, um, you know, if we're going to cultivate the spirit of enlightenment in all our lives, and if we're not going to abandon it, even in our dreams, then why do we really need to mention that we shouldn't be abandoning it when we're not asleep in this life, right? So he said, if we can help to bring people to bodhicitta, who are ready or ripe and are willing to listen, um, uh, uh, to beings in the cities and the villages, or in any place that they may dwell, then we will not relinquish the spirit of enlightenment in our future lives, is what is being said here. So then Je Rinpoche, he sort of mentions a few other cases. He says, for instance, the array of qualities in the Manjushri's Buddha realm is another Mahayana Sutra. He says that if we can destroy our pride, we eliminate jealousy, we eliminate stinginess, and we see joy in the prosperity of others, then we will not relinquish, we will not lose our aspirational pride, prayer, or our aspirational bodhicitta. And he says, and moreover, in our future lives, then we won't be separated from it. And then he concludes very nicely from the King of Concentration Sutra, which is used for many things in these texts, where he says, you know, remember, when we, as much as we think about something or examine it, so much as our minds engage in it, whatever, sorry, so much as when we examine and consider it, whatever we're thinking about, we will begin to engage in it. So he's saying to us, look, you know, we've got to remember that if we want to develop these attitudes, we've got to think about it. We've got to consider and reconsider it again and again. So there's this way in terms of being able to, it's not just going to happen instantly for us. We have to work with it and learn how to develop this strong mind of loving kindness, of sincerity and honesty. Something else I was going to say, but um, probably said enough. So those are the four. Those are the four actions that are correct in terms of our behavior. So then he wants to. Je Rinpoche says, okay, so we've talked about these two aspects. One of the, oh yes, so one of the aspects is about these four for incorrect and for correct behaviors establish future lives, the generation of bodhicitta in future lives, which is really important, because essentially what we're saying is this life and that the future lives are what we need to do to consider. It's not that essentially the ones in the future lives don't affect this life, or the ones in this life don't affect the future lives. But the idea is we need to have, and what I think is very interesting is when it comes to the ones about future lives, they're all about outward actions. So they're talking about our relationship with others. So in this sense, we can see these are very, very powerful social and cultural consequences, global consequences. We know that even the smallest thing can inspire, and it can have a knock-on effect. So in one sense, if we want to look at it, if we want to see in the future, we want to see an improvement of bodhicitta and a continual commitment to and a growth of bodhicitta in the world, we need to ensure that we're modeling the correct behavior for it to be inspiring and for people to be inspired by it. Otherwise, it won't have an effect. And if there is no bodhicitta or lineage of bodhicitta in the future, then of course one's going to find it very hard in the future, if one is reborn, to find it. So again, Rinpoche says we've now covered a series of precepts about about sustaining the aspirational vow of the aspirational vow of Bodhisattva vow of maintaining and increasing our bodhicitta. And he said, you know, there are basically the sort of two rules. He's going to repeat himself a little bit. He says, if I think, um, not just think in I think like, oh, you know, think about, but actually think or determine that I actually cannot accomplish Buddhahood. It's not available to me. At that moment, then we lose the spirit of enlightenment, right? So within a Buddhist context, Buddhahood means something specific, which is the ability to benefit all beings. If we're saying I can't do it, it's not available, it's not possible for me to do this, then essentially we're no longer taking part in that path. It's a bit like saying, it's not any more different than saying, you know, I can't get to Paris, right? As soon as I say I can't get to Paris, Paris is closed to us. So at that moment, our aspiration to go to Paris is destroyed, right? And he says, you know, the four mistaken practices. Don't be concerned if we are not able to sustain those four practices, that we lose our bodhisattva vow, our aspiration in vow. He says that's not the case. They're not there in terms of precepts of saying if you don't follow these, you know, if you break these, then you lose your precept, you lose your vow. They're there to ensure that you have the opportunity to sustain your bodhicitta in future lives by avoiding them, right? So he said it's not as if that these are specifically precepts. And likewise, same with the four correct. He says again in the Kassapa chapter, he says the bodhisattvas who possess the four correct practices will manifest the spirit of enlightenment in all lives immediately after being born and will not cast it aside or forget it until they reach enlightenment. So he says, although in fact, in terms of the Kassapa chapter, the mistaken practices, whether or not they affect this life or future lives, is not explicit. We can recognize that in terms of the way in which it talks about the correct behaviors, we can see that this is actually the case. And he said, you know, we've got to remember these, because he said essentially, you know, look, we're human beings. We've got our mind. We're trying our best to do this. We're, you know, being sincere in our practice. We're doing our daily practice. We're considering all beings. We're generating bodhicitta 6 times a day. We're doing all of that. But yeah, you know, sometimes I lie a bit as a joke. Sometimes I might, you know, tell a little fib or misrepresent myself, you know, in a trifling way, in a sort of silly way, or and so on. I might even say something a little bit sort of critical about bodhisattvas. You know, I might feel a bit pissy or whatever, you know. So I'm not really. And it says this is not good. it's not, you know, it's not great behavior to be like that, but we are humans. And he says this doesn't mean just because we've had this sort of slight, these very, very slight things, that somehow that we lose our vow. Yeah. So we have to be realistic, and we have to recognize very strongly about what it is that's what it is. So he said, so this one, so the one that we are keeping in this particular case is to do, I cannot accomplish it, right? So this one is a precept we mustn't. We've got to be aware of that. And secondly is to mentally abandon living beings. So if and he says, we've said this before, I'll say it again, is that when we consider them in general, we say, you know, I'm not really able to work for this many beings, or for these beings, or you know, for all beings. It's just, you know, I just don't, it's just not going to work. I mean, it takes too long, too much work. I'll never be able to do it. It's just not a valid, it's not a path for me. So at that point, then again, also, obviously, this is abandoning on the aspirational side. So this is saying essentially, you know, going to Paris, too long, just takes too long. The ticket price is too high. The trains aren't reliable. Anyway, Paris, who needs it, right? So that sort of mind says then that essentially, again, you're losing the ability to go there. So it might be like in my Paris example, the aspiration, the compassion is because you want to see your a friend who's ill, and it's like, yeah, they don't, you know, they don't even want to see me, right? So this then it's like, okay, so what's the point going to Paris, right? So this is the sense of saying, by abandoning all beings, then we lose the ability for us to sustain our aspiration. And then he says, you know, and again, it's not just all beings. Generally, you might say, well, you know, look, one being, this one being, this one, I'm not going to do anything for that one. It really, really annoyed me. They're completely, what they do is outrageous. Don't think I can ever forgive them for what they did. It's completely impossible. So once we do that, then the problem, he says, is essentially, once we've chosen one, then why not another, or a third, or a fourth, or a fifth? In the end, it's like you can say, well, actually, I'm not going to do any of those lot, right? So at this point, then we're losing that quality of great compassion, which is complete impartiality, right? So it's like, in a sense, it's absolutely relevant for us to have this mind which accepts without limit and the entire collection of all beings, right? And at that point, it's like saying, okay, we might have some sort of, well, you know, I don't know the Martians or the people on a planet Lala or whatever, but this is sort of not really relevant. The point is to say that all beings, wherever they are they worthy of compassion? Are they worthy of need? And probably, yeah. So, except for those who are already enlightened, everybody else needs help. So there's a part of this here where Je Rinpoche is talking about some of the ways in which this is described in some of the commentaries, and he sort of wants to defend his position on this in terms of keeping it clear that the distinctions between aspirational, the precepts of aspirational bodhicitta and those against engaged bodhicitta, engaged vow. But I think for the time being, it's quite a technical argument. It's available to read if you want to on pages 82, 83. And what I'm going to do is to try and keep it simple in terms of what we need to do, not necessarily why Je Rinpoche has chosen this particular set of interpretations. But from that, there is something I'd like to say, which is that there are different systems. There are regarding aspirational bodhicitta and the sustaining aspirational bodhicitta and what the precepts are. And he does mention that, for instance, there are those from Indrabhuti, Nagarjuna, Asanga, Arasura, Shantideva, Chandragomin, Shantarakshita, and so on. So there are quite a large number of different approaches to this. And this is a commentary that in the main of it, that Je Rinpoche says, you know, it's not actually correct. And in the and then it says, you know, in the commentary it says, because they're all different, in a sense, probably the best thing to do is to uphold whatever system your teacher gives you. Now, I personally feel that that's absolutely correct advice. I think for us, when we find a teacher who's able to teach us and to give us insight into aspirational bodhicitta in a way which is not in conflict with anything that we've discussed, and if they say, well, these are the precepts, to sort of say, no, Je Rinpoche says it's just these two, slightly misses the point, right? So we do need to be aware of the context of our practice, and in the end, the practice is how we make it. But what Je Rinpoche is saying primarily, and I think this is relevant, is that it's very easy to see, to very, very clearly how our aspiration, if we think about it in terms of the metaphor of going to Paris, how our aspiration is destroyed by two particular parts. So everything else is supportive, but it is actually, our practice is only really destroyed by giving up on the goal or giving up on the basis of the goal. So giving up on saying I can't become a Buddha, or giving up on the basis, which is our compassion for all beings, right? So that's the point. So in brief, he says, therefore, his position, is what I've just been not going into all the details of, is with the exception of the precepts not to relinquish the aspirational spirit and not of enlightenment, and not to mentally abandon all beings. Any of the other precepts, with which there are those we accept, such as remembering, considering bringing bodhicitta into our mind 6 times a day, and so on and so on. He says they're not transgressions. In other words, they don't break our aspirational vow, but they certainly help to assist sustaining it, right? He says, but look, let's be clear. If we break the precept, if we don't do something, we're not able to do these, then it's still good in our interim before we take the engaged vows, before we take the engaged bodhisattva vow, for us to recognize that what we're doing is a misdeed. It's not great for our practice, and therefore to confess it and talk either to the in front of the visualized 35 Buddhas, or to our teachers, or to somebody, a sincere practitioner we respect, and the 4 powers. So the confession is not because we have some sort of booth who can then say, look, you're free, you're no longer need to worry about it. It's because it helps for us to be honest to another who we recognize as being a spiritual practitioner, and it helps us to be aware of the fact that we've done this, to say it, right? It's like, okay, this has been done. And then again, with those are the 4 powers, which is remorse, which we talked about earlier on, is like a sense of shame, a sense of this is not what I want to be doing, this is not what I'm comfortable with. So this mind of remorse is important. Now, remorse, we have to be careful of, is a sense of recognizing with sort of pain, oh, I did that and it's really not right. It's not self-punishing. So if we carry on, or we start punishing ourselves, then that's a mistake. So remorse primarily is like that was not, that was the worst, that was bad, that was not right. Not, oh, I need to punish myself somehow. Yeah, I mean, really honestly, emotionally or physically or anything like that. But then there is also, so this is the first power. The second power is work, or is repair, where we actually start thinking about doing additional or reparation work in terms of benefiting, especially something in terms of an opponent power. So if I've been dishonest to a teacher, to think about how I can help and to repair the damage that I've done, but also in terms of add practice, to recognize that this is a good way of transforming this negative behavior, is by is by allowing it to inspire us to practice more, right? So out of that remorse, rather than punishing ourselves, we use it to spur us on in our practice. The third power, again, we have been through this before, but I'm going through it again. The third power is a commitment, a absolutely strong decision and commitment not to repeat it, to recognize just how bad it felt or how bad it feels, and not to, and definitely making the decision not to repeat it. Yeah. And then again, in terms of our practice, and the fourth is to remember refuge and bodhicitta. So primarily the purpose of that is to remember what we're doing, what our project is, what makes us a practitioner, why we're doing this job in the first place. And this helps us to when we were in reflection, to think, actually, you know, this is it doesn't make any sense for me to be doing these things at all. So these are the four powers. They work very strongly to help us overcome negative behaviors. So he says this, we should do these anyway. He said, we don't need to renew this because we haven't broken it, but we do need to be aware of trying to sustain and use whatever training mechanisms we have available to us to help us develop and sustain our precepts. He says, though, but once we have received the engaged bodhisattva vow, which comes on soon, then breaking these precepts becomes a transgression, because we then will be engaged in, we will then have a vow in terms of our behaviors, and these particular ones, some of these are then mentioned as actual transgressions of the vow in as an engaged bodhisattva. So in this particular case, there are remedies and procedures in place within the engaged bodhisattva vow, and then we will need to take those into account. So he said, however, that remembering and regenerating our spirit of enlightenment 6 times a day is really a precept that's specific to the aspirational spirit of enlightenment. Okay, so that there really primarily sets us up for moving into understanding how to practice as a bodhisattva, which is going to be through the 6 perfections, which comes next week. And then there'll be a short mention of the engaged vow of bodhicitta. So what we've been doing so far is looking at the vow of the aspirational vow. And in fairness, and I did mention this before, most of the time, in terms of the way in which it's received, is that nowadays that people are given these combined rather than one and then the other one. They're given either combined in a longer ceremony or in a short ceremony. So the aspect of there being some sort of time between the aspiration and engaged vow is not so commonly found now. But it doesn't mean it's not good, and it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be considered. In terms of our own personal practice, we may be given these vows and really have no strong ability for us to practice them. But if we think about them and consider them, there might be a point when we say, okay, I'm absolutely able to, and I want to consider the aspirational vow as something that I can take on, and then later on, but which gives me just primarily those precepts and these two main things I need to sustain. And then after that, when I feel ready, I can take the engaged vow, the engaged bodhisattva vow. So this step is not and this is why Je Rinpoche wrote it this way. Is that in terms of our practical advice and our practical way forward, it's very good to recognize the importance of the aspirational vow. Okay. Anyway, so I think that's enough for today. And next week we'll go into an introduction to the 6 perfections and of a bodhisattva, which are very well known. So should be good. And other than that, let's dedicate any merit today to inspiration, being inspired, maintaining our own inspiration. Let us consider how we may both continue to inspire ourselves and inspire others in terms of practice, in terms of considering working for all beings, how we may develop and inspire ourselves to consider about the availability of and the recognition of Buddhahood as a worthy and goal that's available to us, and let us dedicate any benefit to actually doing that, to becoming a Buddha to benefit all beings. So let's now just take a minute or so to reflect on compassion for all beings and loving kindness.